what we're going to be going over here is cost, volume, profit graphing, where we're going to be calculating the operating leverage. And starting with our income equation here, this is where we have our selling price minus our variable cost on some per unit basis here, times some sales quantity. Then we have to subtract our fixed cost, and that equals our operating income. So when we're talking about this operating leverage, we're really talking about the degree of operating leverage. And that's equal to the contribution margin here divided by operating income. Now remember, our contribution margin here is really our selling price times or minus our variable cost times some quantity of sales here. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through a cost, volume, profit graph here to calculate our degree of operating leverage. And we're going to be looking at this operating leverage here based on three different scenarios here. We're going to have three different costing scenarios. We're going to have a different variable cost here, and associated with that variable cost here, there's going to be a different fixed cost here. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be laying this out on this cost, volume, profit graph, where along our x-axis here, that's going to be our sales quantity that we're going to be looking at, and then along our y-axis, that's going to be our dollar amounts here, where we're going to have to determine our revenues here less our cost to determine our operating income. All right, so what we're going to have here, and let's look at it here. We're going to have it laid out here where I've got the revenues line here. That's where we're going to have, for our example here, per unit of sales here, our product that we're selling, we're having $50 here is going to be our selling price for each unit of sales here. So that's going to be our revenues, and I'm showing that here in those brown dotted lines. And then we have three different scenarios here based for our costing, and let's just go through those here. So what we would have here for, let's figure our contribution margin here for each of the scenarios. So for C, when we're looking at scenario C here, we'd have a $42 fixed variable cost here, and compare that to the revenues of $50. So the difference is going to give us a contribution margin on a per unit basis of 8 here, for $8 here for C, and then for B, variable cost $36. Compare that to $50 here, our sales price. Contribution margin, that equals $14 here per unit for B, and then for A here, we're going to have a $30 here variable cost versus 50 here. Selling price gives us a contribution on a per unit basis here at $20. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to be looking at these three different costs here and their fixed costs here, and at a point here where the cost is the same for these three different scenarios that we're going to be looking at, this is where we're going to be determining our operating leverage. Okay, so for our revenues here, and we'll be going through this line equation here where y equals mx plus b. M here is the slope, that is for our costs here, and for our revenues here, that's how much on a per unit here that we sell, that's how much we generate here in dollars as either revenues or costs. And then so we got our m here again is our slope times some quantity that we sell, and then we would have to add in the y-intercept, or in this case it's going to be the fixed cost. In that's to determine our total cost here. So first off, let's just go through our revenues line here. We're going to be looking at this inflection point, or this costing point here, where the costs are the same for each of these three scenarios, and that happens to be at 170 units that we sell. So for our revenues, that would be just $50 here times quantity of 170s. That's going to give us revenues here of $8,500. Now for our cost, well, we could look at just one of our scenarios here, but we'll look at all three. Again, 170 units here, and for our costing, let's look at scenario C here. That's that $42 variable cost. So we take that $42 here times X, our quantity of 170, and then we'd have to add in our fixed cost here. So let's look at that. So we have the $42 here times 170. That's going to approximately be $7,100 here. And in that case here, remember, we do not have any fixed cost here for C. So that would be our total costing. Just looking at C here, $42 here times quantity of 170, no fixed cost. So that would be our costing here, $7,100 here for our cost here. Now, we could just use that here for all three scenarios since they intersect, but let's just go through them here to understand how these lines work here. So for B, scenario B, $36 variable cost times a quantity of 170 here. That approximates about $6,100. And then we'd have to add to it the fixed cost here of $1,000. So that's going to bring us up to $7,100. Now for A here, scenario A, it has a $30 variable cost here times a quantity of 170. That brings us up to about $5,100, but then we would have to add our $2,000 in fixed cost here. So that's going to bring us up to $7,100. Okay, so now we can determine our operating income. I went through the mechanics for each of these here just to understand how they worked here with how we had to add in our fixed cost to what we had along with our variable cost for each of those quantities. So our operating income, let's go back to that. It was $8,500 here in revenues, less our costs of $7,100 is going to give us operating income here of $1,400. So that's what we're going to work with for our operating income that we're going to be looking at this point here, that this quantity of 170 units here, where the costing is the same for each of our different alternatives. So for our total contribution, again, just take that quantity of 170 here times each of our contributions here on a per unit basis. So A, it's $20 here times 170 for $3,400 here total contribution. B, what is it, $14 here contribution times a quantity of 170 for $2,400 here in total contribution. For, again, total contribution we mean for the total 170 units that are sold. And then C, what was that? That was $8 here times 170, and that's going to give us $1,400 here in total contributions. So now we can go and we can calculate our degree of operating leverage. So for A here, it's really that total contribution here, 3,400, divided by our operating income at that point here, 1,400. So that's going to give us a degree of operating leverage of 2.43. And then for B, again, that was that 2,400 in total contribution divided by 1,400 here in operating income. That's going to give us an operating leverage of 1.70. And then for C, we're going to have the 1,400 here. There is 1,400 here in total contribution divided by the operating income here of $1,400. So what we're talking about here, this degree of operating leverage here. So what we're saying is the greater amount of fixed cost we have here, the greater degree of operating leverage. So you could see for item A here, we had a fixed cost of $2,000. That gave us 2.43 here, the greatest degree of operating leverage. And then for B, what do we have? We had $1,000 here in fixed cost. That gave us the middle range here, operating leverage of 1.70. And then for C, where we had no fixed cost here, that gave us the lowest degree of operating leverage, or our base amount here, 1.0. So that's what we're looking about here is this fixed cost, and we'll get into looking at it here. Or let's just look at it in these terms. Our operating leverage here, that's the effect that our fixed cost here has on a change here in our operating income. And that's based on changes that occur in our units sold here and our contribution margin. So we'll look at that relationship here next. The only point is we're looking at these different scenarios here where we have them set up where we have a greater variable cost here, and along with that greater variable cost here, we have the least fixed cost here. And then we have our mid-range term here and of B scenario, and then A here where we have the lowest variable cost, but we have the highest fixed cost. And what we're going to be looking at here is the fact that we get this higher degree of operating leverage, we're going to have a higher operating income. Okay, so let's go and let's look at it here in our other. All right, now let's go over this degree of operating leverage. This is where you would have your risk-return trade-off, and it's really measured by the operating leverage here. This is where you'd have a small change in sales. That's going to equal a large change in your operating income, either positive or negative, depending on where your sales are. Okay, so let's look at our graph here, and let's concentrate in on our revenues line here. I'm showing it as that brown dotted line here, and then we have our three costing lines here based on our fixed cost and our different contribution margins on a per unit basis here. So really what we're going to look at is our fixed cost. Our green line here, we have a 0 fixed cost, versus our blue line here where we have that $2,000 fixed cost, and each have a different contribution margin. So the blue line here is a contribution margin of $20 per unit versus the green line, which has only a contribution of $8 per unit. Okay, so let's look at it relative to this revenues line here. All right, so for our green line, we move up along our line here, and you can see we don't really have any break-even point here in our green line. We're making a profit the entire way from whatever number of units we're selling all the way on up, because we have some contribution that's going towards income here, because our green line is always below our brown dotted line here, our revenue line. But if we look at this blue line here, where we've got this high fixed cost here that we're starting with at $2,000, you can see the difference here between our revenues line and our fixed cost, or the $2,000 fixed cost blue line here. You're running some negative income because you're having some costs here and you're not generating enough revenues to cover those costs until you get to the break-even point here at 100 units. But if we proceed up the lines here, we get to this inflection point here where this is where we calculated that degree of operating income, and this is where the income here, $1,400 here, is equal for all three different alternatives that we looked at: a 0 fixed cost, $1,000 fixed cost, and a $2,000 fixed cost, along with their different contribution margins. So this is where we're going to have this inflection point, and this is where everything changes. So our blue line, where we have the $2,000 fixed cost, it reverses here. You see the green line, we have a higher cost here. Once we get past that inflection point, our green line, we have a higher total cost here based on that lower contribution margin, even though we had a 0 fixed cost. Now our blue line, it changes just the opposite here. So we're having a lower cost here based on our higher contribution margin, and even though we have the higher fixed cost. So that's where the leverage comes in. That's where you see it. You can just look at these costing lines. They're tilting up this way and tilting down this way. So the higher the fixed cost you have based on our contribution margin here, this is the greater, when you get past this inflection point here, this is where you're going to have your greater total contribution, because you're costing here with that leveraged effect that we're looking at here. You're going to have a lower cost here versus the fact here that you had no leverage fixed cost here for your green line. So that's where you're looking at that degree here of operating leverage, and it's really the change here that you're having based on, at some point here, you're going to have equal incomes you're generating, so there's really no advantage to either one of the alternatives, but you're going to have an advantage here when you're using the fixed cost once you get past that inflection point. Okay, so that's what we want to look at. So the other thing is, you can understand here, if we have to generate at least 100 units here in sales just to break even with the $2,000 fixed cost, we're really having a higher risk here. We're having a much higher risk here based on that $2,000 fixed cost, or risk of having a loss. So we have a greater chance here of having loss and also less operating income here. All right. So, and then the other thing is, again, the risk here is where you're going to have less profit and less operating income if you don't sell enough sales. So that's if your sales are low, that's where you have that risk. But on the other hand here, if your sales are high over here, then you have that greater chance of a profit and greater operating income. So that's just looking at our leverage point here. So if you just look at your costs here, how they're levered here based on that equilibrium point where each of the three different alternatives have the same income here. But once you get past that, leverage effect takes an effect here, where you get greater, you can see it, your spread between your revenues line here and your costing line is different here for each of the different alternatives. All right, so that's what we're talking about with the leverage effect. Just looking at the tilt here, and it's tilted against making a profit here with the higher fixed cost. But then once you get up, when you have those greater sales, then it's tilted in favor here of the higher fixed cost. So that's what we're talking about, the operating leverage. And for the example that we went through here, this degree of operating leverage, we had 2.43 here for our A alternative, where we had that high fixed cost and higher contribution margin here. And what we're saying by the 2.43 is that it is the change in contribution margin here is, well, almost 2.5 times what your alternative C is here, based on that zero fixed cost here, but it had a lower contribution margin. Okay, so that's really what we're looking at here. High sales, this is where you're going to have your return here. You're going to have greater profits and greater operating income. Low sales, this is where you're going to have less of a profit, less operating income, and very much a chance here of a loss. That's where your risk comes in. You got a chance of a loss here when you have that higher fixed cost. But it leverages itself out here in favor of high sales. Okay, so that's our degree of operating leverage. And just to go over it one more time here, looking at it in these terms here, you'd take your small increases in sales equal large increases in operating income. That's when you're in the area here where you have the inflection here, where your blue line, your costing line here, is with the higher fixed cost and higher contribution margin, has a less cost here than the line here with the lower fixed cost and the lower contribution margin. And then the opposite is true here when you're operating at where you have small decreases in sales over in this area here. That would equal large decreases in operating income here. This is where you're going to have the greater risk here of an operating loss that we looked at. So really you're looking, the idea here with this leverage here, this degree of leverage here, this is where you're looking at smaller changes in sales are going to equal larger changes in operating income, depending on where you're sitting here in your sales. Greater sales, you're going to have a greater operating income here based on the larger fixed cost, or the greater fixed cost and the greater contribution margin per unit. Okay, so that's all we're talking about. And then one other thing we want to look at here is the fact here that when you have changes in sales here, it's going to change your operating leverage numbers here. So we're going to look at the case here where, let's say here, we have a sales increase here of 50% here from 170 units up to 255 units. So let's look at it. Let's look at our calculations just to understand it. So your degree of operating leverage here changes here based on different sales levels. So looking at our total contribution here, based on 255 units times the contribution here for each of our items on a per unit basis here for A, B, and C, we're going to come up with a total contribution number here. So then we can determine our degree of operating leverage simply taking that, say for A here we had a contribution of $5,100 here at that 255 number of units sold, divided by the new operating income. You'd have to go out and calculate your operating income at these 255 units we're selling. So that's going to give us a degree of operating leverage of 1.65. We were sitting at 2.43 here when we were sitting at 170 units. We moved up to 255. We had to recalculate our degree of operating leverage. It was lower here, 1.65. So in this case, our change in contribution margin here versus our C amount here. The C, where we have no fixed cost, it just stays at a unit of 1. So we're generating 1.65 times more here with that higher, based on our higher fixed cost here, than we are with zero fixed cost here, C. And the other numbers change the same here. So for B, we would have had that new operating income divided by the total contribution here at 255. That brings our ratio down to 1.38 and was sitting at 1.7. So you can look at the different alternatives here. And let's just go back up here to our graph. Okay, so we really are sitting with three different alternatives here. We can either have zero fixed cost and we would have a lower contribution margin, or we can go with a higher midterm fixed cost here, 1,000, and we have a little mid-range here contribution margin here of $14 per unit versus 8 here for the 0 fixed cost. And then we have the alternative here with go with the higher fixed cost, alternative A here of 2,000 fixed cost, and we'd have a greater contribution margin here of $20 per unit. So this is where you have to calculate your degree of operating leverage here to determine how your changes here in your quantities sold and your contribution margins here, different contribution margins affect your fixed costs. So those are the things you want to be looking at here. And this layout here was just to determine, look at how this operating leverage actually worked here. And we focused in here on a neutral point where the profit or the operating income was the same for 3 different alternatives, but it flipped here. It flipped it once we got looking at sales that were less than that break or that equilibrium point here. It was in favor of the lower fixed cost here with the lower, or the 0 fixed cost here with the low contribution margin, versus the higher fixed cost here, 2,000, and the higher contribution margin. And just the opposite, once you got past that point, the opposite was true. We were in favor of the higher fixed cost here with the higher contribution margin versus the lower, or the green line here, the lower fixed cost with the lower contribution margin. Okay, so that's about what you'll be looking at here when you have to determine the degree of operating leverage. Just remember, you have to calculate that degree of operating leverage if you're going to do any comparison purposes based on your quantities that you're at specific sales quantities, and based on your different contribution margins and your different fixed costs to do a comparison. You don't have to do all 3 of them here. You could have just used 1 here, but we did the 3 here just to understand what we meant by that degree of operating leverage. Okay, so that'll summarize our topic.